Welcome to week 5 of World History since 1500. This week we're looking at the industrial and urban revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. We've got some good news. For this week you can count any one of a number of articles by me on world fairs, industrialization, or money and banking that appeared in the World History Encyclopedia and that I'm posting as a PDF on the class Blackboard site. You can count any one of those as your outside scholarly sources. Of course, you're also free to find your own outside scholarly source too. I want to start out by showing these rather telling statistics. Look at the top 10 cities in the year 1800. Notice that 7 of those cities were in what we know as Asia. 100 years later, the top 10 cities of the year were almost all, in fact, they were all in either Europe or the United States, except for number 7, Tokyo, Japan. Clearly, something was happening during the 1800s, or what we call the 19th century. Whereas Asia, that is Eastern civilization, in the West had been more on a par with one another in the year 1800, at least in terms of what we might see as some of the definitions of civilization or prosperity. Clearly, by 1900, Western civilization had pulled ahead. We're going to start to discuss this week and also next week the reasons for that. Whether we're talking about China or Japan, the Middle East, or Europe itself, there was a phase before industrialization which is called proto-industrialization. This dealt with what is sometimes called the cottage industry or the putting out system. And how this would happen is merchants would buy things like wool, and they would put them out. That is, they would give the wool out to peasants who worked in their peasant cottages. They were farmers, the peasants, but the women and other, and others could work on little piecework in addition to the farming that they did to gain some extra money. So you see here a woman at a spinning wheel, and she is spinning wool or flax, whatever it is here, I cannot tell, into yarn. And then there would be the next process of weaving yarn into cloth. So these were things that peasants could do in their cottages, hence cottage industry, and they could earn generally a certain amount of money per piece, or what we know as piecework. Well, the first or early industrial revolution really begins in the mid to late 18th century, and Britain is the place that it begins. Here we begin to see the movement of cottage industry into centralized factories powered by steam machinery. And these steam machineries, of course, are powered by coal. So lots of people ask the question, why Great Britain? Well, Great Britain had nice supplies of coal and iron. It had laborers for industrial production. This is very important. It had a stable government. Merchants, manufacturers, etc. Are reluctant to invest in countries very often where the government is unstable. Great Britain was very compact with many transportation links, many rivers, and they would build many canals, as well as they would later on by the 19th century get into railroads. Also, they had a colonial empire where they could get some of the raw materials and sell some of their finished goods. And London was already in fact a center of investment, banking, and capital. So all of these things are important and the reason why Britain moves ahead and starting really what we see as the first industrial revolution. Industrialization of the 19th century is going to be founded upon really 2 keystones. The first of those is going to be the steam engine, which replaced water-powered mills. And the steam engine could be applied to any kinds of steam-operated machinery. So steam boats on rivers, steam ships on oceans, steam locomotives and railroads. Each of those developments in turn contributed to what we're going to call the shrinking world of the 19th century. This is a term actually that I first found in a New York Times article. It was from the mid-19th century. And they talked about all the wonderful developments of their time period, and they said that they were living in a shrinking world. Obviously, people were being tied to one another, goods were being tied to one another via the new transportation links more than ever before in history, and they saw this as truly a revolutionary time. The second thing that was very important during the 19th century was the development of mass-manufactured iron and steel. Well, one of the wonderful buildings that would be constructed of iron and steel was the Crystal Palace in London in 1851. And this was built for one of the first world fairs, major world fairs in history, the International Exhibition in London in 1851. And here you see all of the different flags of the different nations who came and set up displays of the latest manufactured goods and other cultural displays that they had and that they were very proud of. This became the series of a number of world fairs, and you can read all about it in my article in the World History Encyclopedia if you like. Now, for a while, the United States lagged behind Great Britain, as did most of continental Europe. And there was a reason why the U.S. lagged, and that's because it had plenty of land available for people to go out and pursue agriculture. It had few laborers for industrial purposes, at least until immigration really gets a start in the 19th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, President Jefferson had established an embargo act, essentially saying that we're not going to trade with the warring parties of Europe. So that certainly was affecting things here in the United States. Very early on, Francis Cabot Lowell, at a place that would later bear his name, called Lowell, Massachusetts, and at some other places in Massachusetts, established really what one might consider the first kind of modern industry in the United States. It was a cotton factory, and Lowell, Massachusetts, of course, was named after him. The way he got laborers is he employed farm girls. But the thing that he had to do is he had to make a very nice community out in a rural area so that he could attract the farm girls. And these were farm girls, young ladies in their teens, perhaps in their early 20s, some of them. And they were, at the point where they were still single, they could earn an extra income from their family, squirrel away a few dollars, and then eventually get married. And once they got married, of course, they would no longer work in the mills. You see some of these Lowell mills somewhere between 1870 and 1920. This is courtesy of the Library of Congress. But they were actually mill towns, so he built nice dormitories that were residences for the girls, and there would be people working in the dormitories providing them with, 3 solid meals a day. There would be lectures and all kinds of things so that it would retain the morals of the girls, and it would be a fine establishment for them to work and earn a little extra money. Well, the kind of factories that Francis Cabot Lowell developed, we'll soon see, will largely disappear from the industrial scene here in the next decades. After the Napoleonic Wars, British manufacturers began dumping finished goods on the American market, very often below prices charged in Britain itself. That did not help American manufacturing either. By 1820, New York City had only 35 companies employing 10 or more workers. So what happens? How does the United States begin to catch up and rev up? Well, one thing that shows what happened is the U.S. patent offices and how many patents were filed. If you notice, between 1790 and 1860, only 31,000 patents were filed. From 1860 to 1930, 1.5 million patents. So much is happening in terms of the technology and science. In 1793, Eli Whitney in the United States invented his cotton gin, and you see it here on the left. And this was a very important invention because you turned the handle here, you put the cotton in here, and what it did is it pulled the seeds out of the cotton. And of course, that would have all had to have been done by manual labor before the cotton gin. Eli Whitney went on to really start interchangeable parts. And the interchangeable parts that he perfected would be applied to all kinds of things, like clockmaking by Eli and Seth Thomas. It would be applied to gun making by Samuel Colt. So the fact that you would say make a gun, and if the part of that gun broke, you could replace that part because of these interchangeable parts that were being made in factories for the first time in history. Well, the United States also benefited from steamboats. The first one to appear on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers was the New Orleans in 1811. It benefited from roads, national roads being built. The Erie Canal, which was just the largest public works project of its day, 363 miles long, connecting Buffalo, New York to Albany, New York. Literally the Erie, Lake Erie to the Hudson River. And this canal was very much influential in making New York City a vast manufacturing area and a growing metropolitan region. By 1840, there were over 3,300 miles of canals in the U.S. The first real railroad in the U.S. was 1828, the Baltimore and Ohio. By 1860, there were 30,000 miles of railroads in the United States. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. And by 1880, there were 93,000 miles of railroads in the United States. It was also very important that the U.S. connect itself well with Europe and with other areas. Typically, a voyage across the Atlantic Ocean, if you had a sailing ship, could take anywhere from 1 to 3 months. Imagine a voyage of that length. The steamboat, however, the steamship rather, cut that journey by 1850 to 11 days and 8 hours. And that was the best time. So you can imagine you're cutting things down to about a week and a half, from anywhere from 1 to 3 months. In 1866, they laid the first telegraph across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, connecting, of course, Europe with the United States. Actually, the first one broke, and they had to lay a whole entirely new one because searching for the break was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The United States would also benefit from the number of immigrants coming to the U.S. because they provided a source of labor for industrialization. You can see between 1850 and 1920 that more than 25 million immigrants came to the U.S. By 1855, more than 60% of the employees of the Lowell cotton mills were Irish. So instead of being farm girls from the area, now the farm girls were being replaced in the Lowell factories by Irish. By 1860, the U.S. ranked second to Britain in industrial production in the United States, and sometime by the early 1880s, the U.S. surpassed Britain in industrial production. Now, we talked about proto-industrialization, which was before the first industrial revolution. We talked about the first, or what's sometimes called the early industrial revolution, which got its start in Britain. And now we need to talk a little bit about the second industrial revolution, which took place from the mid to late 19th century all the way into the early 20th century. It was really marked by two things: steel production, steel rather than iron, and also oil. Notice how we're moving from coal to oil, iron to steel. It also was an era of industrial chemistry. And at the forefront of that movement was Charles Goodyear, and of course what would become the Goodyear Company, known for its tires. Other U.S. inventions of this time were the air brake on railroads, the telephone, the incandescent electric light bulb that we know was Thomas Edison, the sewing machine with a lock-stitch design, the cash register, the phonograph, film camera, motion picture camera, the all-electric starting motor, which came out of Dayton, Ohio, by the way, and of course we know that two brothers from Dayton, Ohio had the first manned heavier-than-air flight as well, and that was Orville and Wilbur Wright. Well, we also know that there were, in this time period, business and marketing innovations. And we'll talk a little bit about a man named Andrew Carnegie. He was a Scottish immigrant who came to the U.S. at age 12, and he held a job in a factory and slowly worked his way up and made his money off steel. Carnegie, or sometimes it's called Carnegie Steel. A very wealthy man. He ended up giving away some $300 million of his fortune, mostly to Carnegie libraries across the United States. But that may have been his philanthropic side. On the other side, he made a lot of his money on the backs of his workers. He had factory workers who worked for very low wages, 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Part of the way he made his money was by pioneering vertical integration. That is, shown in this little chart that I made for you, the control of an industry from raw materials to manufacturing to transporting the finished product. So, for instance, he began to buy up coal and iron ore mines. That gave him the raw materials to produce steel in his steel mills. Here you see one of the steel mills at night in Pittsburgh. Then he had to transport that steel. A lot of the transportation was done along the Great Lakes, and so he began to buy up shipping. He owned shipping companies on the Great Lakes. That's called vertical integration. Well, another person who made a lot of money was John D. Rockefeller. He made his money in oil. Now, in the 19th century, oil was first of all used for lamps, and it was used to lubricate all of the steam machinery. He incorporated the Standard Oil Company and got rebates from railroads to assure that he would continue to give the railroads his business. Sometimes the rebates he received from the railroads were more than he paid to ship things. So in essence, some of the companies were paying his shipping costs. Obviously, that meant that the smaller shippers, people who weren't as influential as John D. Rockefeller, were paying for heavier shipping costs. By the 1890s, the Standard Oil Company controlled 90% of all oil and was the largest business enterprise in the world. John D. Rockefeller pioneered horizontal integration through a system known as trust. So, for instance, trustees of Standard Oil began to own stock in competing companies. This was a stock swap, literally. When the federal government saw this as a restraint of trade, Standard Oil merely reinvented itself as a holding company that bought competing companies. Either way, Standard Oil was acting as a monopoly, controlling prices, territories, etc. By the time of the 1890s, when he controlled 90% of the oil business, his company employed 100,000 people and was the richest, biggest, most feared, and most admired business organization in the world, said one historian. Rockefeller became the nation's first billionaire. He died at age 98 in 1937. And he received a lot of criticism as well. In a magazine called McClure's Magazine, Ida Tarbell ran a scathing denunciation of Rockefeller. Other stores were starting to really begin and operate in this time period. Some of them were called five and dime stores, and this was a brand new idea. These were sort of the pioneers of today's kind of dollar stores and discount stores. You know, in the stores of the early 19th century and stores for centuries, actually, you would kind of go in and there would be the shopkeeper, and maybe you wanted to buy something, and the shopkeeper would kind of argue over price and settle on a price. And F.W. Woolworth, his name was Frank W. Woolworth, and S.S. Kresge were two men who said that this is kind of a ridiculous system. Instead, we're going to start stores where everything is either 5 cents or a dime. There's no negotiating over the price. Instead, we're going to just have low prices every day. And they built a whole series of stores across the nation and even worldwide. And it was Woolworth 5 and 10 cent stores and Kresge 5 and 10 cent store. Woolworth is now out of business. It went out of business, I think, in the 1990s. Kresge became Kmart. And so this is kind of, again, the pioneers of our dollar stores and our Walmarts and Kmarts today. Major department stores, the huge department stores, were also beginning at this time. Alexander Stewart, John Wanamaker, Marshall Fields, R.H. Macy, of course we know that today as Macy's, and J.C. Penney. And then we've got to, of course, talk about Henry Ford. Henry Ford was an electrical engineer with Detroit Edison Electric, and with other investors he opened the Ford Motor Company in 1903. He introduced the Model T, which was a 4-cylinder. It was available in one color only, black, and it cost $850 in 1908. Well, anyhow, he studied meatpacking plants, and he saw how they moved the animal carcasses from point to point on overhead hooks. So this gave him an idea. He said, why can't we do this when we're manufacturing automobiles? And he introduced a moving assembly line in 1913. And this just revolutionized the industry in many industries. He sold 248,000 Model T cars in 1914 alone. In 1914, it took 93 minutes to assemble one car, just 10% of the time it had taken a year before. So, I mean, he cut off the amount of time to make a car by 90% through his assembly line. By 1925, he was turning out more than 9,000 cars a day, literally one every 10 seconds. And the result was the price of the Model T had gone down from $850 in 1908 to below $300 in 1925. Now, the assembly line work was very boring for the workers, so there was a high turnover. So he found that he had to increase wages in 1914 to $5 per day, and that was about $2 more per day than the prevailing wage. We know Wilbur and Orville Wright of Dayton, Ohio were bicycle manufacturers, and they made the first manned heavier-than-air flight at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina in 1903. And then Charles Lindbergh in 1927 flew from Long Island, New York in his single-engine Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic. It was the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. It took only 33 hours. He was called Lucky Lindy, and he was a great hero of his day. Handsome, he did not smoke or drink. He was a hero of his time. Well, one of the things that results with all of this industrialization is a great urbanization, people moving to cities. Again, we have a wonderful map here that shows you how few cities there was in Europe in 1800 that had over 100,000 people, and how many cities there were in 1900. So urbanization increases vastly during the 19th century. Let's look at some population statistics to see how London grew in the 19th century. In 1801, London had 959,000 people, less than 1 million people. By 1901, it would have 4.5 million people. Look how small New York was in 1800, 60,000 people. By 1850, 515,000 people, and by 1900, 3.4 million people. Truly amazing, because by this time period in 1851, London became the largest city in the world. It was still at that peak in 1901 as the largest city in the world. The fact that cities grew so rapidly and that industrialization had happened so quickly obviously led to some conditions that were really horrific for the working class. Charles Dickens, who lived from 1812 to 1870, was a British author who in a number of works, Oliver Twist, David Copperfield and others, showed how the conditions of the working class, how bad they really were. The working class was living in overcrowded tenements. The cities like London were polluted. They were disease-ridden. They lacked decent sanitation. Let me read you something from this wonderful book by Michael Patterson called Voices from Dickens' London. He asks you to imagine what it would be like if you were a visitor coming to London across the Thames River and seeing it for the first time. And he says, by the time you would have reached the Thames, you would have long since noticed another abiding aspect of London life, the smell. To anyone coming from the country, the smell of London must have been overwhelming. First, there was the smell of coal fires. The vast forest of reeking chimneys filled the air with smoke, which covered buildings with unsightly layers of soot and left dirty, black smuts on clothing and faces. There were the multifarious stenches of industry, breweries, foundries, and forges, chemical works, and worse than all of them, tanneries, with which the coach passengers would already have become acquainted while traveling through Bermondsey. There was also the aroma of horses on which so much of London's transport and commerce depended. The smell of a stable multiplied 1,000,000-fold. There was the scent of hundreds of thousands of people whose tightly packed lives did not allow them opportunities to keep themselves, their clothes, or their homes clean. Just imagine what London was like, or any large city at that time. And we can even imagine more what the dwellings of the working class were like. This is a very famous engraving entitled Over London by Rail by Gustave Doré. And if you notice, you see a big railroad trestle here and a railroad trestle in the back, and this steam locomotive billowing smoke out. And here you see all of the tightly packed tenements, one on top of another, backyards running into one another, people hanging out clothes, and people all in very overcrowded situations. Let's see what our friend Michael Patterson in his Voices from Dickens' London has to say about some of these working class residences. He said the dwellings of the poor did not have plumbing, and the privies, usually communal, led into cesspits that simply stagnated underneath the houses or into ancient sewers that led into the Thames River, which provided drinking water. Many people simply used a convenient corner or a hole in the floorboards, and excrement lay around in hallways and rooms and on stairways. The stench in these buildings was unbearable to those not used to it. In addition, there were the nuisances that inevitably go with lack of cleanliness. Rats and mice were everywhere, as were cockroaches. Between 1865 and 1915, more than 25 million immigrants came to the U.S., more than 4 times the number who had arrived in the 60 years prior. Meanwhile, the population of Europe, although it was providing immigrants for the United States and other places, was still increasing. Notice that despite all these people leaving, and those were just the ones for the United States, there was others leaving for Canada and Australia and different parts of the empire, for South America, for Africa, etc., for Asia. Despite that, the population of Europe west of the Ural Mountains increased from 187 million, more than doubled in 1900 to 401 million people. Well, let's look just very quickly at a few of the scientific achievements of the era, because a lot of these scientific achievements are going to eventually go hand in hand with developments that are social and or political, or they will be applied to industry and successfully marketed. Let's go to a man called Marie-Jean-Pierre Florin in 1825. He experimented with chickens, and he alternately removed the cerebrum from some and the cerebellum from others, parts of the brain. And he proved conclusively from that the brain was the center of thought processes. Now, obviously, if the brains of chicken, if this worked with the brains of chickens, he assumed, again, that the brain of the human being was the center of thought processes. No one was going to remove that. That would have been horrific experimentation. But this confirmed something that humankind had hypothesized about, but had no real confirmation of before that. And then I think we're all familiar with Louis Pasteur in his germ theory of disease in 1865. There was a problem with the wine in France. Things were going bad. The wine was going bad. And so he studied the wine and found out that there was something, namely germs, which were microorganisms, that were turning the wine bad. So what he did is he gently heated the wine. He literally pasteurized the wine. The same process which bears his name, pasteurization, the warming of wine or the warming of milk to kill off the germs. And this, of course, would lead to the germ theory of disease. That was in 1865. It would take a long time for that idea to become prevalent. It was during the Civil War in the United States that, without understanding of the germ theory of disease and the need to keep things very clean and antiseptic, 2/3 of the 600,000 people who died in the Civil War in the United States died because of disease. And some of those diseases were brought about in the surgeries to remove limbs, because they would reuse bandages. While they would kind of clean the blood off the instruments, they wouldn't sanitize them, sterilize them. So literally, infections were being spread from one to another. Later on, the German physician Robert Koch would isolate the bacterium that caused tuberculosis in 1882 and that which caused cholera in 1884. Now, we all know that viruses are smaller than bacteria. They're the things that cause stuff like colds and flus. And viruses are parasitic on humans and other living beings. While the viruses themselves, were not discovered until the late 1890s and early 1900s, and rather fortuitously, Dr. Edward Jenner had discovered a vaccination against smallpox. And so vaccination actually dated from the 1790s in Western civilization. And that's when this English physician, Dr. Edward Jenner, noticed that milkmaids, literally those maids that were milking cows, seemed to have an immunity against smallpox because many of them the milkmaids had been exposed to a related virus, cowpox. So he figured if you could take a bit of the cowpox and vaccinate people with it, that would give people an immunity against smallpox. And it turned out that he was right. Can you imagine the very, very courageous people who volunteered for that experiment at first? Let's talk a little bit about the Frenchman Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. In 1809, in something called Zoological Philosophy, he talked about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Let's take an example. An example would be, say, a giraffe. And he would ask the question, how did giraffes get long necks? And he proposed that, well, what happened is where giraffes live, the food sources were becoming less and less available and on the ground and more available high up in the trees. So Mama and Papa Giraffe would go ahead and stretch their necks some, and their son or daughter would have slightly longer necks, and so on and so forth until literally each generation, after stretching its necks enough to get to the food sources in the trees, so finally a giraffe had a really long neck. Now, we know that this is the wrong mechanism of evolution, but nevertheless, it was kind of the first step towards an evolutionary type of thought. Charles Darwin would take this to the next level. He signed on aboard His Majesty's ship, the Beagle, and went to the Galapagos Islands off of the coast of Latin America. And there he saw these very glorious birds, finches of all different types and colors. And he saw how out on the Galapagos Islands they had evolved differently than the finches on the mainland of Latin America. And so he began to develop his idea of evolution through natural selection, through literally survival of the fittest. And he published this in a work called On the Origin of Species in 1859. So let's take that same giraffe example. Charles Darwin would say, okay, so it became more and more difficult for giraffes to get the nourishment that they needed, the food that they needed from the ground. So what happened is those giraffes who had longer necks were the ones to survive. And those were the ones, since they survived, who reproduced. And so, yes, their evolution is occurring. The shorter-necked giraffes are dying off. The longer-necked giraffes are breeding. And the evolution is occurring in that manner. Still, no one knows that evolutionary process is taking place through genes. Nevertheless, people like Herbert Spencer take this idea of the survival of the fittest and they apply it to sociology, to this evolutionary theory that, well, perhaps this is true of human beings too. Perhaps, say, wealthy people and intelligent people are more fit to survive. And perhaps some of the poor really aren't well fit to survive. So the question begins, should we pander too much to people who really aren't fit to prosper in the world? In 1882, German biologist Walter Flemming published a book explaining how he had witnessed the process of cell division, or what we know is mitosis, by dying cells. And in 1888, Wilhelm von Waldeyer called the thread-bearing portion of cells chromosomes. Now we know that chromosomes double in cell divisions except in egg and sperm cells, and by 1953 the number of human chromosomes was set at 23 pair. Now if we take what Wilhelm von Waldeyer did and we add to it the discoveries of Gregor Mendel and Thomas Hunt Morgan, we can start to see the pattern and then use the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin to see what happens. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who published a work in 1866 in a very obscure Austrian journal explaining his experiments with peas and the transmission of traits from one generation to the next, literally dominant and recessive traits. Mendel's work was largely forgotten until 1900 when it was simultaneously rediscovered by 3 separate men. And soon after that, scientists began to draw connections between genes and chromosomes and the evolutionary cycle. One of those scientists was a Kentuckian by the name of Thomas Hunt Morgan. He and his colleagues discovered the X and Y chromosomes in the early 1900s. Meanwhile, in chemistry, John Dalton in 1808 resurrected an older Greek theory, the atomic theory. Dmitry Mendeleev in 1869 would create the first periodic law in the periodic table of the elements. And Michael Faraday would do experiments with electromagnetism, which of course would lead to dynamos, the first electric turbines, and electricity. All of this, the industrialization, led to the shrinking world of the 19th century, and this is our conclusion. The first regular steamship service across the Atlantic, 1838. The first transcontinental telegraph in the U.S., 1861. The first successful transatlantic telegraph, 1866. First transcontinental railroad in the U.S., 1869. The Suez Canal opened, 1869. The telephone exhibited in 1876. The wireless, what would become radio, in 1901. The radio tube in 1904. The Panama Canal opened in 1914, and a year later, to celebrate that, at the San Francisco Panama Pacific Exposition, they made the first extensive use of motion pictures. You see what's happening here. Industrialization is tying the world together. It's a shrinking world, and we know what that shrinking world is going to lead to. It's going to lead to next week's discussion of the nationalist, liberal, and imperialist revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries. If you have any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Hope you have a good week. Thank you.